get comments and remarks from, from other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, the rapporteur. Now, first shadow for the S&D Group, Alfred Sant.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start by congratulating Mr. Rosati for his text, for his presentation, and to thank him for it. However, I would suggest that we need to be a bit more critical of the way in which the growth survey has been put forward and the way by which it has been launched. I think we have to be also realistic in the sense that we have to admit that there's a big cleavage within this committee, within this parliament, between two ways of handling the crisis. On the one hand, there's the predominant move forward towards fiscal consolidation, and on the other hand, there's the other approach of working towards expansionary policies. We don't agree on this. There's a majority which wants fiscal consolidation and thinks that's the way forward, and quite a big minority which says the contrary. It says no, focus on expansion first. And in order to move forward on that, we have to accept that there's this cleavage. And we also have to accept the fact that we're in politics. We're not just technocrats. People expect from us a political reply. And that political reply must reflect the fact that, as shown in the latest European parliamentary elections, there's big dissatisfaction with the way by which the European economy is developing. So I believe that in our reactions to the growth survey, we have to reflect that dissatisfaction. There are, of course, things on which we agree, facts on which we agree. For instance, we agree that the economic growth rate of Europe is suboptimal and has been suboptimal to bad over the last few years. That's something we agree on. We agree that unemployment is too high. We agree, as Mr. Rosati has just said, that investment, public and private, has been too low and has stayed too low. Where we disagree is how to interpret what has been happening and how to deal with the situation. I would therefore like to make some remarks in this context. First of all, if we look at the Eurozone from a long-term perspective, one has to conclude it's a sub-optimal monetary zone. It's not an optimal monetary zone. And it has been therefore the subject of an ongoing political project, an ongoing political process by which we try to compensate for that problem. And that economic divergence has actually increased over the last few years rather than decreased, in spite of the compensatory mechanisms that have been introduced. This is something we have to accept. And it is in this light that we should interpret then and understand then what the Commission is proposing in its growth surveys. We lack the centralising focus of a monetary union, and on the other hand, an attempt has been made to compensate for that by discretionary mechanisms that are politically controlled, like this semester process. It's a political process. We have to accept that as well. And we have to interpret what goes on in those terms. So what has been the major development in all this? It's still the same development that the Commission is proposing. Okay, we're talking about three pillars, but the real pillar has stayed, is going to stay, as a primary tool of cohesion, fiscal consolidation. And that is something which we are trying to steer through on the basis of a number of measures, scoreboards, quite a positivist approach to the problem. You have the tools, the instruments, the measures by which to calculate how things can be steered towards a certain direction, and you move on that basis. It's giving the impression that we are under control, but we are not in control of the situation. And one reason for that, I discussed it with Mr. Rosati actually, is that the markers we have are historically based. They relate to a situation that goes back 22 years ago, when we talk about 3% of GDP as a definition of how the deficit is going SQ. That relates to a reality that goes back 22 years. And therefore, the problem could be that the instruments that we are working on and that are being implanted in the surveys we have before us are not good enough. And they're giving us wrong results. They're giving us results, or they're giving us indications on which we work that are faulty. I've been looking at the autumn forecasts made by the Commission since 2010, 2009. looking at the forecast they did, year after year, every year, the autumn forecast is adjusted 2-3 years upstairs. So if you look at 2011, there are 3 forecasts for growth in 2011, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. The actual was 1.4. If you look at the forecast, 3 autumn forecasts made for 2012, it started 1.8, went down to 0.5% real, and the end of it was minus 0.4. The actual was minus 0.7. If you look at the forecast for 2012, it started at 1.8 growth. It went on to 0.5% growth. The third forecast was minus 0.4. The actual was minus 0.7. If you look at the 2013 report, starting at 1.3% growth, went down to 0.1% growth, went down to minus 0.4 growth, the reality was minus 0.5% growth. And if you look at the report for the forecast for 2014, they started at 1.4, went down to 1.1, and down to 0.8. It's going to be less than that. So what's my point? My point is this. We think we have the measures by which to understand what's developing, but we don't. We have instruments that need to be audited, that need to be critically considered, and we're not doing that. So all the time, even when we talk about, for instance, fiscal consolidation, there is necessity for some fiscal consolidation, but the reality is that it's operating as an internal devaluation. And an internal devaluation is politically very dangerous, socially dangerous, and economically ineffective. This is the real problem. And that's why then, when we come to interpreting how things move forward, we defer. It's not just a question of a technocratic assessment. It has to be a political assessment. What does internal devaluation mean? It means this, Mr. President, that the Eurozone has locked itself into a situation where to remain competitive through internal devaluation, it's eroding the social model on which Europe is based. There's no other way out. To become competitive, you have to erode your social model. And that is, of course, then a trap. A trap because it undermines social cohesion. Are we on the right track? The Commission basically is telling us, and some of our members here are telling us, we're on the right track. But if you look at the policies that have been followed for the last 3-4 years, and you ask, look at the economy. Has the economy been moving? And they tell us, yes, it's going to move, it's going to move. I remember a guy called Galileo, back in the Counter-Reformation. And he understood that the sun doesn't go around the earth, but that the earth goes around the sun. He had to accept that he was wrong. But then he also said, eppur si muove. It still moves. Well, before the European economy, as it's moving now, and they tell us it's going to move, it's moving, eppur non si muove. That's the conclusion I come to, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Now, for the ECR group, Mr. Sampo Terho.
Thank you, Chair.